Good evening, everyone. We're going to try to start on time because we have a lot of really interesting, I think, topics to talk about today, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to hear some of your questions. My name is Jody Platt. I'm on the faculty of the Department of Learning Health Sciences. I'm also a member of the Dissonance Committee, which is sponsoring this event tonight. In case you don't know, the Dissonance Committee is a university-wide collaboration from a number of different schools and offices that are listed here. Just a couple of housekeeping items. A reminder to keep your cell phones quiet. This session is being recorded and will be posted, so you can check the website later for the recording itself. There's an opportunity to sign up for other events on the Dissonance website, and there's a Twitter feed. Are you doing that, Matt? Anyway, somebody's taking care of Twitter and it's being live tweeted, and you'll be able to see those things going on. Feel free to participate in that conversation. So welcome. I'm going to just give you a little bit of background on what it is that we're going to be talking about today, but mostly we're going to be hearing from our my colleagues seated to my left. We're mostly going to be talking a lot about health information, and health information today means a lot more than what's in your electronic health record. It can be anything from your social media posts to things that you're wearing on your wrist or rings, survey data, claims data, pharmaceutical biomarkers, biospecimens. It can be the sort of ones and zeros. It can be the notes in electronic health record, or it can be actual sort of samples from who you are. The vision of health information that's often cited is the patient being at the center of this, but who really is at the center and who decides how this information is shared and used is, I think, going to be a theme of the things that we hear today. Traditionally, the way we've collected health information is either through research, clinical care, quality improvement, increasingly apps, and each one of those entry points for data has its own set of rules and regulations around it. The reason we're here today and having this conversation in part is that these avenues are much less clear than they once were. And for the most part, we have a lot of the data already, and we're continuing to collect more, but as we collect it, it can be used for any of one of those purposes. So what are the rules that we should be following? We know from at least some of the research that I've done that when we talk to people about how comfortable they are with health information being out there and being used for multiple purposes, there's not a whole lot of just general comfort with that. So you'll see from this data in this slide that there's even some level of discomfort with health information being shared with people providing your own personal care. We also know that the public, for the most part, isn't differentiating between, say, quality improvement and research, but the regulations and the laws around each of those are very different. So for the most part, consent is waived for quality improvement exercises, and there are much stricter rules around research. There's a lot of information these days in the media. I'm not going to obviously go through each one of these, but you can see it's a fairly chaotic ecosystem that's raising, at the moment, more questions perhaps than answers. So it's some things to think about as we hear from our speakers. What will patients get from the health information sharing that's going on? What are your own expectations for privacy? Which institutions do you trust to protect your privacy? Do you trust researchers to use information from health apps? And what rules should there be if we don't already have them? So I'm going to read the bios from each of our speakers. I'll read them in the order you're going to see them, so it's not necessarily, actually it is pretty close to this order. So Lori Andrews will go first. She is a distinguished professor of law at Kent College in Chicago and the director of the Institute for Science, Law, and Technology. She's also the author of 14 books, including 3 mystery novels. The American Bar Association calls Lori a lawyer with a literary bent who has the scientific chops to rival any CSI investigator. She taught at Princeton, wrote for a television legal drama, and served as the chair of the Federal Advisory Committee to the Human Genome Project. She advises governments and professional groups ranging from the Emirate of Dubai and the French Parliament to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. Her path-breaking pro bono litigation caused the National Law Journal to list her as one of the 100 most influential lawyers in America. She'll be followed by Kate Spector-Bagdady, who is a lawyer and ethicist and faculty at the University of Michigan Medical School. She's also chief of the Research Ethics Service under the Center for Bioethics and Social Sciences and Medicine and chair of the Michigan Medicine Research Ethics Committee. She's a former attorney for the biotech industry and was associate director for the Obama's Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. Her research focuses on the secondary research use of health data and specimens and the privatization of genetic information. And then finally, Denise Anthony is a sociologist whose multi-method research explores issues of cooperation, trust, and privacy in a variety of settings, from healthcare delivery to microcredit borrowing groups to online groups such as Wikipedia and Prosper.com. She also studies organizations and institutions in healthcare delivery. Her current projects examine the use of information technology in healthcare and the implications for the privacy and security of protected health information. So welcome. Where you are on. Nope. Sorry.
Thanks so much. When President Obama started the Precision Medicine Initiative, he had the idea of combining your genetic sequence with your medical record, lifestyle information, and what you input into your medical apps. So think of the boundless set of information that would then be gained about you that researchers would have access to. But he wasn't the only one interested in what was going on with medical apps. Tens of thousands of medical apps are available, and in Google Play and in the App Store. And many people are using them for their own health interest. About 58% of smartphone users have downloaded a medical app. And employers are getting into this area as well, sometimes requiring that their employees use medical apps or their health insurance will be rated up and they'd have to pay $300 or more per year for health insurance. So lots and lots of medical apps are available. You can get hundreds of apps that allow you to self-diagnose whether you have bipolar disorder, that tell you what treatment you should be getting. There are apps where you take a picture of a mole and then it compares it to other moles to tell you whether it's cancerous or not. These often aren't very good, and the Federal Trade Commission has in fact gone after a few of these app developers, but people really are taking health into their own hands in order to diagnose, treat, monitor, prevent diseases. What happens to that information, though, that's inputted into those apps? A lot of times it's collected, shared by third parties, it's monetized, sometimes without the individual's knowledge or consent. And a federal trade commissioner has suggested that many of the most sensitive aspects of our lives are now accessible by third parties. And apps do create the possibility of disseminating very sensitive information. The ones we studied had you put in your mood, any suicidal thoughts, your relationship with animals, whether you're using illegal drugs, your HIV status, how much time you spend with loved ones with pets, your credit card for in-app ordering of medications, and so forth. And yet it surprises many people to learn that that information is not at all protected by HIPAA, our primary means of protecting health privacy, in part because HIPAA only applies to information in the hands of healthcare providers and healthcare institutions generally. So at the Institute for Science, Law, and Technology that I direct, we decided to do a study of medical apps, and we wanted to see what they told users they were going to do with their information. And then we wanted to look at transmissions from the app and follow it to see where your information actually went. So we kind of hacked it. We put up a proxy server that could actually collect information before it went to the internet so we could see where this information was actually going. One of the researchers who worked with us on it, Michael Goodyear, is now a second-year student at the law school here. So how common are privacy policies? We were shocked to learn that about 19% of the privacy of the diabetes apps we studied didn't had privacy policies, the majority did not. So we thought, well, it must be much, much higher for psychiatric apps. That's sensitive information. You'd want to know where that information was going. And that only had 38% of those had privacy policies. And often they were very hard to find. Some you had to figure out who the developer was, go on the developer's website. The language was very difficult to parse. And so it was really hard to protect yourself in advance by figuring out what a privacy policy was as you were choosing among 200 or more bipolar apps or diabetes apps. So we looked at what the apps collected, what they stored, what they shared. And we found that a number of them, 49% of the diabetes apps and 59% of the psychiatric apps, put tracking mechanisms on your phone, things like cookies, web beacons, so it could tell other things you were doing in other apps, who your contacts were, what web searches you were doing, and so forth. Now, to me, as a lawyer, I was particularly interested in the fact that many of these privacy policies said, oh, they're not actually intended to protect privacy. So they actually said that in their disclaimer. And about 73% of them said, oh, we can change our policy at any time. So here I am, if I go through and I have asthma, if I was buying an asthma app, I could try to find the one most protective of privacy, and the next day they could start selling all my information without even having to email me or so forth. So for a subset of apps, we dug deeper and said, where does this information actually go? And we used these sorts of programs in order to do it. You know, at most it cost us like $50 all told, and buying burner phones so that other information about us would not, lead to certain ads and that. And here's what we saw on the screen. It was just like constantly what you see outlined in blue shows that this particular app, RxWiki, where you can look up side effects of drugs, was giving that information to DoubleClick, a big marketing and advertiser. And so you would think that apps with privacy policies might be more protective of your privacy, but it turned out with our diabetes acts about apps, those with privacy policies were actually slightly more likely to give your information to third parties than those without them. And about 69% of bipolar apps shared your private information, your suicidal thoughts, your journals, your feelings about your relationships with advertising and analytics companies. So you can see that's problematic. You don't have any of those protections you do in the doctor-patient relationship, not just HIPAA, but doctors have a fiduciary duty to act in their patient's behalf. They can be sued for malpractice. They have statutory duties about doctor-patient confidentiality, and that just does not cover the information on apps. In addition, I'm particularly concerned because the apps actually get more sensitive information than your doctor does, because the apps use the accelerometer, for example, to see what your gait is like and can actually tell if you are going to get the flu, have a propensity for stroke or Huntington's disease before it affects you. So I might be able to keep things from my doctors if I were in that percentage that was not that interested in sharing with my own healthcare providers. But here, life insurers, employers can buy information about you that you don't even know exists. Now, some companies that collect data have private policies, very few, about what they will or will not disclose. This one, Healthline Networks, says, oh, we protect privacy of certain health information. We won't sell your HIV status, the fact you have impotence, or that you have an eating disorder. At the same time, they will sell information that you have bipolar disorder, overactive bladder, and anxiety, which might be equally sensitive to some people. So what can we do? I'd like to suggest a few things. I think that app developers should notify you in advance. Think about only 19% of those diabetes apps even told you what they were going to do. So they should at least have a privacy policy. I don't think they should be allowed to change it. It's a contract like an informed consent form is. I think that we should treat health information in apps and in devices as if it were part of the doctor-patient relationship in terms of confidentiality, and California has a statute that does that. I also don't think this information should be used for research without actual consent about a specific study. And I would actually go so far as to say that there should be a flat rule that app developers should not be able to sell your medical information. There are certain types of information we protect. You know, like employers can't even ask you, hey, are you planning to get pregnant while you're working for me? And this should be one that should not be part of the market, shouldn't even be asked about. Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here with you tonight.
Does the walking mic work?
Oh,
No? Cool.
walking mic?
No worries. Okay. That one's mine. Nope. Nope, that's not my deck.
Oh,
That's okay.
that's not yours.
Nope, that's okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Kate Spector-Bagdady, and I focus on not just health data, but mostly genetic data in particular. And we'll talk a little bit, delve a little bit more deeply into the market for selling and acquiring your genetic data. So I'm going to make two observations, as Professor Andrews already said for us, but sort of meta-level observations. And the first observation is that our biospecimens and health data are currently governed. So all of our laws and regulations are focused on governing our data by methods of procurement, right? So we're talking about how data are coming in. That's how we govern them. But our data and biospecimens often end up being used in many of the same ways. And the second observation is that while our governance is based on method of procurement, what people actually care about, if you bother to ask them, is use. And those two observations hopefully will get me tenure and keep me working for many, many years to come, is this inherent conflict between the way we govern and what people actually care about. So a couple of examples of how specimens and data, no matter how they're coming in, get mixed are, one, actually data are coming into private genetic testing and health data collection companies, like Professor Andrews was talking about, through apps, through direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies, and then get sold to academia, to the drug industry, to insurers, but they also go the other way. And actually, academic institutions also commercialize their data. And so they're going both ways. And so these data and specimens are getting all mixed in, no matter how people consented to them. However, the rules governing them are completely different. So it's almost like signing the contract that changes after you've already contributed your data. That's exactly what's happening. You're signing a contract with a specific institution who has to disclose certain things, and then the data is completely changing hands and in a totally new area. So the example I'm going to give you is the direct-to-consumer genetic testing company 23andMe. Has anybody heard of them? Yes. Okay, so let's talk about 23andMe for a few minutes. And there are several major genetic testing companies that do this, so I'm not just picking on them, but this is the model. So this is an example. So you spit in the tube, you send it in, they send you back a link, you log in, and this is an example of some of the risk reports that they might give you. So this is me, and this is my 23andMe report, and I'm reading this, and it says my risk of obesity is 50%, which doesn't sound that great. And then I look at compared to the average risk of the population, and it says 60%, which sounds worse, but does that mean that I'm more or less likely to become obese than the average person? I have no idea, and also know that the genetic variants that I have that are associated with obesity mean a lot less for my health than the fact that I eat my leafy green vegetables and I exercise. So much of this information is actually practically not of much use to the average person. However, that's not the point of the business model. The point of the business model is not to make money selling you $200 worth of information that you don't really need. It's the data that's going out the back end. And that's why these genetic testing companies are valued at, so this is $1.2 billion in 2015. Now they're worth $1.5 billion. And the value of that is the data. The value is not the spit tubes. Because it doesn't matter whether they're returning to you, even potentially really clinically actionable information, and it doesn't matter whether they're returning to you totally worthless athletic information if you're not an Olympic level athlete, and it doesn't matter whether they're returning to you your ancestry information, because what they're generating on you can be much, much broader than what you're contracting to receive in return. So just like Professor Andrews said, where you just agree that you're going to talk about bipolar disorder, but they're reaping all this additional information off your iPhone, that's the kind of thing they can do once they've gotten your specimen. And also, when you log into 23andMe to see your result, all these little survey questions pop up. And they ask you about, did you get stretch marks when you were pregnant? Were you anxious in high school? So they're collecting all this phenotypic data to go along with your genetic data. It's amazing. People answer, so they have over 5 million customers at this point, 23andMe, and they answer over 2 million survey questions a week. Can you even imagine the data trove that they have? The data trove is so big that even if some people totally make it up, it doesn't even matter because they have so much data they can correct for that. This data makes them an extraordinarily valuable collaborator for things like private industry, for places like NGOs, and for academic researchers like myself. So here are just some examples of the amazing research that they have honestly enabled since they got started. And they've partnered with the government, they've partnered with academic institutions, and they've also partnered with private industry and sold access to their data for millions of dollars. But this raises a sort of academic inquiry question that I have of this clinical information versus research data value gap, right? So there's this massive gap between the value of the information for clinical purposes for the individual versus the research data that they're generating. So really they're collecting data on you, not really to help you, but to help the next iteration of you when they buy the better product that you helped enable. So, all right, this is gonna get really sophisticated, so I'm gonna really need you guys to pay attention. You guys ready? Okay. So this is Randy the researcher. And Randy, he wants to do his genetic research, and he's overwhelmed by the IRB paperwork. He's new, he doesn't even have a research associate to help him fill it out. And it's gonna cost him money, and he needs to recruit all those participants, and he needs to sit in the study clinic, and he needs to ask one person at a time for their informed consent. And this is Cindy the consumer, and bless her heart, she thinks it's a good idea to send her genetic information and her phenotypic data and her money to someplace like 23andMe, who's going to return her largely unhelpful clinical information. 23andMe is then going to take Cindy's information, de-identify it, and do things like patent it. Or do things like sell it back to Randy the researcher, and it's going to be much better for him because he only has 5.5 years before that tenure package goes in, and he does not, and he has to publish 35 articles, and he does not have enough time to go through all that IRB paperwork. And so he sends his money back to 23andMe, and I know who this looks like a really good deal for, and it's not Cindy and it's not Randy. So why does this matter? Why do we care? Like Ann Wojcicki, the CEO of 23andMe, she's a genius, good for her. Why does this matter? 3 reasons. One is access. So access to the diagnostic tests and the information that they can generate, right? So a good example of this is Myriad. So Myriad Genetics was the only company where you could get your BRCA variant testing for association with an increased risk of breast and ovarian cancer for almost a decade because they patented it. Now, the Supreme Court later found that you can't actually patent a genetic variant, but in that time, they had amassed the only good database of these variants in the world. And so even the day after the Supreme Court said you can't patent that anymore, so they didn't hold a patent, but they did hold a monopoly on the data set that could provide the best results. Second problem. We know this better on the drug pricing market, but drug prices rapidly go up and down on the basis of demand. So that could happen exactly to the data market. We have no idea. It hasn't yet, but it could. Right now they're playing fair. They might not in the future. And the last point I want to make is the problem, and this is data in and data out. So the data going into these big data sets are biased because they're the data generated by the kind of people that can afford fancy diagnostic tests or can afford recreational genetic testing that's not particularly helpful. And those kinds of people are largely white. And if you look at our genetic databases across the globe, actually people of of European and Asian descent account for only 20%. But if you're looking at people of African American ancestry, of Middle Eastern ancestry, of indigenous people, of mixed ancestry, we're only talking about 4 or 5% of these people. So on one hand, we want to protect people from unwittingly becoming data points when they didn't consent to begin with. But we also have a bias out problem, because if those are the kinds of communities that we're collecting data from, those are the kinds of communities that any advances in medicine, like from the precision medicine we have, like the Precision Medicine Initiative, will be applicable to. And they won't be able to use it if they weren't represented in the database to begin with. So that's my last slide, but those are the points that I wanted to make about not just data, not just health data, but some of our most personal data possible, our genetic information. Thank you.
Well, this is great because the way these, all of our talks, I think, kind of weave together is really terrific. And in fact, maybe I can even skip a few slides because it's sort of already covered. But so I'm going to talk about patient trust and implications for privacy. And I want to make a couple of points. First, some patients have high trust and some patients have low trust, and that has implications for what they do, how they interact with the healthcare system, which has privacy implications more broadly. So, patients vary in their level of trust of healthcare providers, right? And it's not random who does and who doesn't trust. It is patterned based on experiences of discrimination, experiences of stigmatization, and experiences of less than high quality care. And those experiences are both current and past. And so those patterns are related to race and ethnicity. They're related to gender. They're related to LGBTQ identities. They're related to SES characteristics like education. They're also related to health conditions. Whoops. Health conditions. Did those come up individually? Well, hopefully. But health conditions like mental health, like HIV status, and addiction, for example. So lower levels of trust, particularly trust in the confidentiality of sharing information with your healthcare provider, can lead patients to behavior that then has consequences for their interactions with the healthcare system and ultimately their health. They withhold information from providers, withholding information that might be relevant and beneficial to be treated on, but which they're worried about sharing with providers for some of the reasons that have already been covered, but even with a trusted healthcare provider like their physician. They may not use certain treatments or apps or interventions recommended by health providers or recommended as being beneficial for their health when they're concerned about trust and the trust and confidentiality. And they may even avoid care or using other kinds of tools like patient portals or access to their own information. Lower trust, particularly in the confidentiality of providers, is also related to less confidence in the safeguards that we already have in place. So safeguards like laws like HIPAA or GINA protections, the ethical practices of the professionals charged with delivering them health care, and even in the technology, the confidence in the technology itself to keep our data private and secure. So what does this mean for thinking about genetic testing, for thinking about big data, and the combining of all of this data as we have just heard? So it means that particular groups of patients who have that lower trust are less likely to participate in these kinds of interventions as well. Now, if we're concerned about the problem of the implications of all that data sharing, maybe them opting out and not participating is a good thing. But as Kate Spector-Bagdady just said, we also are concerned because it means they're not in the data itself. And so to the extent that there are real benefits to these interventions and precision medicine, new tools that can help improve health, identify health problems before they become problematic. This is a problem because systematic groups of patients may not be participating and therefore are less likely to benefit from these tools, exacerbating health disparities. So, but we also think that the tools themselves might also have harms. We've heard about some of the harms already, but let's consider some of the apps like Professor Andrews was talking about, like an app from CVS or your health provider or even your insurer that sends you reminders about script refills and medication adherence. These have been shown to have real benefits for patients with chronic disease who take complex medication cocktails, like for HIV, for example. So if you are somebody with high trust, that reminder might be enhancing to your relationship with your healthcare providers, because you might see that reminder as a benefit, as somebody helping you or supporting you, your doctor, maybe even CVS. However, if you start out with low trust to begin with, you might suspect that reminder has something to do with suspecting that you might not have high adherence, that you might not be compliant with the recommendations of your doctor. There's a really great old Seinfeld episode where Elaine needs to steal back her electronic medical record because there's a note in there saying she might not be compliant with the doctor and she's a troublemaker. For patients who are concerned about that kind of information sharing, an app like this has very different consequences in the meaning that it's giving to patients and the potential for harm in that relationship. We already, let's see, sorry, I'm losing my, my train here. We might also think about the adherence score that might be shared with other third parties, like Professor Andrews also talked about. But the sharing might be available not only to other health apps or your health insurance, it's available to other apps. So when you apply for that mortgage loan on your phone, you might then have information that comes from that app. And if your, let's see, your medication adherence score is low and you're non-compliant with your medication, what might that tell a loan company or a leasing agency about your behavior and the implications that might have for that loan behavior? So even though we also think that there are harms from participating and not participating, those who don't use the app because of low trust, who aren't in the genetic database, don't just have the risk of not getting the benefits. They might still be subject to the harms, to harm from those apps, even if they aren't in there. So we already see this happening in areas with, for example, online searches for names, resume screening tools, recommendations for sentencing and criminal justice. So groups are categorized and classified based on the behavior of other members of the group that may harm you even if you're not in the data set. And we see this certainly happening already with these kinds of tools. And we already see this also happening in targeting services either to benefit certain patients or certain groups or to limit access to services for other patients or groups. So for example, the fact that Amazon Prime looked at the buying behavior of its members, or to target whether Prime services would be one day, sales services would be available in certain neighborhoods or certain communities, and to restrict that in other neighborhoods or other communities. It means that my behavior, whether I'm in the data set or not, may not matter at all, but the behavior of all of you who are around me has implications for me and vice versa. So what are these implications for privacy then? How is this related? I want to focus really just on one in the last minute or so that I have here. And this, because it's an issue that doesn't always get attention. So even though we often talk about privacy as an individual preference, maybe an individual right and value, and therefore we want strong rules around, say, consent, for example, to protect privacy, privacy is in fact social. It's dependent on the social dynamics, the social norms, and the social institutions, like we've heard, laws, rules, and regulations. So without social institutions governing and guaranteeing privacy, other important behaviors and social processes can break down, like confidence in healthcare providers in general, confidence in the data systems and the safeguards that we have in place, participation in research, maybe even democracy itself. But that's another talk. Therefore, the implications of privacy are not only that we need to establish clear and strong requirements for consent to information to protect individuals and groups, we also need institutional remedies with clear rules, standards, and regulations about how the data can and can't be used, and possible restrictions on who can access that data. We want to ensure that our data are used in ways that produce clear benefits, both for individuals and for society as overall. So recognizing that privacy is social and that my privacy is related to your behavior and your privacy is related to my behavior, I just wanted to end with this quote from Priscilla Regan from her great 1995 book, 1995, think about that. And because these things are becoming more exacerbated and more clear with technology and the rapid advances we're having. So privacy is becoming a collective value because it's hard for any one person to have privacy if we don't all share a minimum level. So the punchline here is that trust, that patient trust matters, and it won't only affect consent and our ability to participate, it's going to end up affecting all of us. Thanks.
All right. So questions?
So I guess I'm thinking about, I guess it's possible that apps can sell data to health insurers. And then the other thing is, just like, how many years are we from having laws so that we do start to get some protection, so that we don't, like the app data being sold to health insurers, end up being a basis for pre-existing conditions, or from preventing us from all this stuff that you guys are warning us about?
Well, I'm actually optimistic about laws protecting privacy because we've seen that. Okay, I'm optimistic because we've seen that in other areas where it was declared privacy is dead. Like when the portable camera first came out and, was able to snap pictures, every generation of technology, they've said privacy is dead. But it takes a long time to get legislatures to move. The Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA, to protect people against their genetic information being used against them in the healthcare, insurance, and employment setting, took 17 years to pass in Congress, and then it passed almost unanimously. I mean, by that time, if we wait that long in this area, all our information will have already been collected, and so it would be of no use. So this is something you all should work on now. Find a senator who's interested. Markle, others.
I would say, though, that it is starting to shift a little with the new European GDPR. So there's these very expansive new European data protection laws that are not just for health data, but for sensitive data. So I don't know if you guys have been logging onto European websites lately, but this new warning on the cookies pops up, and of course everybody just is like, yeah, whatever, just let me read my website. So I don't know how effective they're being, but big companies that work in Europe and also with California, because California also just has a new Data Protection Privacy Act, aren't going to bother doing state-by-state business models. They are going to defer to the You Are the Weakest Link. Remember that show? Am I too old? But yeah, they're going to go for the strongest data protection because it's not worth it to them to do state by state. So I think that if you can get a couple more big states like California, maybe something on the East Coast, that companies are just going to start deferring to those actions.
It's interesting, though, how little knowledge some lawmakers have about the technologies, because I was really excited when California passed something that seemed to protect health information from apps and on websites like, WebMD. But if you read it, it's only it's the sort of information that one gets and shares with your doctor, and so doesn't cover actually a lot of the things I care about, and wouldn't cover things like gait information or things that so we need to do a lot more educating of our lawmakers as well.
And just a note of caution to not be pessimistic, but when HIPAA was passed, it essentially established a floor of privacy protection and information security protection. And California and a few other states actually had more sophisticated, more protective laws, but when HIPAA passed, it sort of reduced to that lowest level. Mm-hmm. So I hope you are right that a few more states will up the, pull us closer, say, to the GDPR, but there is some real risk that when the federal government decides to create a federal standard, they actually lower the bar.
And you asked about health insurers. Life insurers are the ones very interested in this, and so some consulting groups are now going around and telling life insurers, oh, don't bother doing those blood tests and urine tests to, predict health. They're costly. It takes a while to get them back. Instead, just look at people's social media pages. And these are the things that are thought to be problematic in your behavior. If you eat fast food, if you commute to work, if you're an avid reader, it breaks my heart. I've written 14 books. I want everybody to be an avid reader. Or if you have a friend who's a skydiver, they actually say behavior is contagious, even though I'm like a huge wimp and have a friend who's a skydiver but would never do it. So this is already being incorporated into decisions about you, as you've pointed out. And that's such a good point, that it's really based on aggregate data, what your friends do and so forth, not even just what you do.
Nice job following up a lot of aspects of it. And I think you focused on the regulatory side of it, if that's how you build it, that's okay. There's also maybe some recommendation to be made to the developer communities, and I think for example, the Association of Computing Machinery, whatever that group is, has some nice ethical principles that I think are that have been developed by that association, but I'm not sure the extent to which we're really pushing those out. And then those of us who are in healthcare arenas, for example, maybe need to take some responsibility for, when we're involved in app development, asking for the people we contract with, or the developers, for those privacy protections in the apps we're developing. And it's like shared responsibility for this, not just legislative and rulemaking.
I think if more people push for privacy by design, especially, say, in healthcare, that is going to, more than, I'm all supportive of the ethical standards for developers and tech companies, but I think we need more than just the ethical practices. We need actual design tools. We need commitment to that technology being built in from the beginning, rather than just thought about in a privacy policy, for example.
But it's not just the people who are sharing their data, it's the people who are building these.
Right.
The people who want to use these apps.
And there are tools and techniques and for privacy by design in the technology design itself. We just don't have standards around that necessarily.
Yeah, that would be a great idea, especially, 7% of doctors are now prescribing apps for patients, and some of them have no idea. I know the psychiatrists were shocked when I told them what the bipolar apps were actually doing, so some responsibility there. But there are also, most medical apps are not designed with any doctor in sight and so forth. And they go up on the web for sale. Like there was one diabetes app we studied, it's diabetes recipes, okay? So all it did was mainly just a data collection device, it showed 12 different recipes in rotation. In the meantime, it collected all this information about you, including it turned your microphone on so it could tell whether you ate in restaurants, ate at home, had sex with people the same sex, the opposite sex. It was a goldmine for information. Now, you know, there are many apps like that. We found 6 months later a substantial percentage of the apps that we had studied had already disappeared. You know, they just, you know, they aren't even beneficial to the consumer. They're just like sucking up data. So maybe some responsibility too on, you know, Google and Apple in terms of what they require of the developers before they can, you know, post an app for sale. That would make a huge difference.
And pedigree requirements of people who are buying this data, like Google and Apple and Facebook.
Yeah.
Like, you could put pressure on them. So one of the problems with these apps is they're like whack-a-mole. As soon as FTC can get rid of one, like 10 more have grown in its place. But you can hold these big public companies in particular accountable.
Did you see a difference in apps offered by like groups associated with healthcare, like CVS or like a patient portal in the hospital, and these kind of apps that are just collecting data?
You know, we didn't design our study to look at that. Now, the National Health Service in Great Britain has done some privacy analyses of apps, some of which are available in the US too, but they found that even ones that were, you know, developed with privacy in mind were actually engaging in problematic behaviors. So some of the, even the nonprofit ones were as well. So it really is about changing norms in a large measure.
But if it is an app developed by your health provider, for example, or it is going to be covered by HIPAA, so there will be some limits there.
In terms of the information you're sending to your healthcare provider, for sure.
If the app is operated by them. So within the scope of that, but I think the way Jody started the conversation about talking about how this data is becoming mixed, the barrier between the information used for healthcare delivery versus that used for research versus that used for consumer targeting or whatever is the lines that used to be fairly, you know, bright lines are now being kind of washed away.
And some other game app on your phone might be collecting the stuff that you think you're privately sending to your doctor, that, you know, where that transmission is covered by HIPAA, but secondary uses of it by other apps. I mean, dictionary.com puts 233 cookies on your computer to, you know, collect information about other things you do. So.
So you mentioned a bit ago that a lot of these apps are not created with medical doctors' insights. So my question is, how important do you think it is for medical doctors to be involved in healthcare policy at large?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is important. Some of these, though, that are kind of lifestyle apps, which are preventive health things. Doctors traditionally haven't had, you know, the same degree of education in as maybe people in the public health arena. And so forth. But I do think there should at least be almost like the Good Housekeeping seal of approval, like some medical group, whether it's a group like the American Diabetes Association that has both doctors and consumers, should take a look at them, rank them, and so forth. I'd love to see more doctors get involved as programmers and so forth as well.
Good.
Oh, yeah, I would just underscore that I think it's really critical that clinicians and healthcare providers are involved at the policy angle. One reason is that policy and health policy conferences are rife with people like us, and we love each other, and we're great, and we really like to talk to each other, but we can sometimes talk in cyclical circles and not actually realize one thing that, now that I'm embedded in a hospital and spend so much time walking the halls of a hospital, is really surprising to me, is sort of the reality of so many things that we talk about theoretically in health policy. So for example, I focus on the ethical use of secondary bias specimen research, and I was talking to a colleague. I just gone to like a 3-day conference at Harvard, devoted nothing to talking about secondary research with biospecimens, so that's a lot. of time on a topic, and he was like, well, did they discuss what we're supposed to do with our cell lines? And I was like, wait, what? Say more. And he's like, well, because they're totally different than fixed and frozen tissues. So what are we supposed to do once we've generated these cell lines, which aren't even part of anything that we ever took out of somebody's body? And I was like, oh my God. Like, we just had no idea. And so that's so critical. And then the other thing I will say is that legislators really love talking to the source. So we're helpful for providing background, and we're helpful for providing legal analysis, and we spend our entire day on this stuff, so that's great. But give them a doctor, and they're like, oh, it's a doctor, right? And no, which is great. No, it's good because they really want like individual stories. You've all seen like the politicians in the rallies. They want those individual stories. They want the actual actions and application. And so for those two reasons, if no other reason, I think clinicians should definitely be involved in policy.
I do have to tell you a story, though. When I chaired the Federal Advisory Commission of the Human Genome Project, and this is before GENO was passed, and I had all these people whose insurance had been, health insurance had been stopped because of their genetic makeup and so forth. I had all these folks. I went to lawmakers and said, can you get us a celebrity on this issue? And it turns out that there are actual PR firms in DC that will provide celebrities for different issues, not even related. I mean, it's not even like Angelina Jolie and her breast cancer. It was like Sissy Spacek on a farm issue because she played like a farmer's wife in one of her movies. So the day of wanting to hear from the source may have passed, and then you got to get Kim Kardashian on your issue.
I'll just add from some of the work I've done with both patients and providers. So patients do want to hear from their clinician, their provider. They want to know about that confidentiality still matters to the provider. But of course, that's within health care delivery. It won't necessarily apply to the apps or some of these other things. But the challenge for providers, I think, like doctors, in talking about these things, so in a study we did interviewing physicians about confidentiality as well as other clinicians like nurses or also other staff like the IT staff in health provider organizations. The physicians say, of course, confidentiality is extremely important and that's part of their ethical practice. But then when asked about what about the confidentiality of all that information from your patients that goes into the electronic record and all of that, and they say, well, that's the IT guy. Pretty specifically. And, we can't fault them. They are experts in clinical practice. They're not experts on IT. And yet that disconnect, I think, is problematic and sometimes leads to missteps that we see when, there's a breach from an internal mistake or accident, somebody's putting data that ends up being on the internet or something like that. But it also, I think, just means that we haven't set up the institutional safeguards in the laws or other kinds of rules and regulations to govern this kind of information. So clinicians, yes, but they can't speak to all the issues, I think.
So as you were talking about trying to invite more of the doctors or anyone who is really on the healthcare side to involve in the design of future healthcare apps, what are some incentives for them to be involved, because they already need a lot of time to devote to treat the patients and and trying to save lives or whatever. What are some incentives to engage them in the conversation, because there's that stereotype of people, doctors probably don't speak the same language as the IT person. They probably are talking about the same thing, but they're using different languages, so there's no way to kind of communicate. That frustrates both sides, and they probably end up being we don't want to work together, and we'll just work separately. And how do you see, what are some ways to mediate that kind of misconnection or miscommunication?
I mean, I think there are a variety of groups and both in industry, but also in places like academic medical centers where you have lots of clinicians engaged with health IT people, and we also have people in field of informatics and other, you know, practices who are going into clinical environments to try to understand how to make the tools more useful. I think some of the challenge comes from some of the app developers out there, or the 23andMe's maybe, who are, you know, they are really interested in the data. And so, you know, that's not going to just be getting clinicians involved to help limit the harm that might come from that, I think.
And so we found that there were a lot of actually harmful apps out there. For example, we've so many actually tell you what dose of medication you should take based on your symptoms. So there are diabetes apps that tell you what, you know, how much insulin you need. And we found that some of them are designed where the orientation of your phone, it gives you a different amount. So I could be overdosed if I'm holding the phone that way. We also tested a bunch of the apps that say, we're going to tell you about drug-drug interaction, you know, which are fatal. And we put in fatal combinations of drugs, and only 23% of the time did they actually identify it. In one of the bipolar apps, where they also were to warn us about fatal doses, we put in like 1,000 times the fatal dose of lithium, and it said, good job, and offered to sell us more lithium, because obviously we're the biggest buyer in the Chicago area. So, you know, some of those may in fact have had doctors, you know, in the beginning, you know, saying, okay, this is the proper dosage or whatever, but then the design is not done correctly, and so we need kind of checks all along the way.
So the FDA is responsible for at least some oversight of medical practice, namely medical devices and drugs and food and stuff. But something that falls short is supplements. And it seems like these apps are the digital analog of supplements, but are quite different in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Is there a way to get the FDA involved, or some other agency?
Yeah, so I really like that analogy. It's a good one. So FDA is desperately trying to get a hold of a lot of these things, because while we think traditionally of medical devices as an implant or a crutch, FDA does consider many of these applications to be medical devices if you're trying to individualize medical recommendations. So they sort of draw the line between wellness applications and medical information applications. So WebMD would be an example of a wellness application where if you just put in some generalized information, it's going to give you some generalized feedback, but it's not necessarily personalized as your genetic information or your mole or something. So FDA is very much trying to get involved in sort of the your mole kind of information back, and does highly regulate things like direct-to-consumer genetic testing.
So in the past, the FDA emphasis in terms of apps have been regulating those that work in conjunction with an already regulated medical device. So if I'm using my iPhone app to connect to my insulin pump to determine dosage, where some of these other ones, which equally, you know, tell you dosage or things like that, they haven't moved into that field. And you could see the issue with the just sheer numbers I put up in terms of tens of thousands. So instead we have the Federal Trade Commission coming in, you know, saying this was a consumer fraud issue when the mole app didn't actually, you know, function, but it means that some people didn't go to their physicians who had cancerous moles because of information they were given by this app.
I have just a couple of comments. One is about doctors, and that is doctors are already so pressed for time with patients. It could take 15 minutes just to talk about a colonoscopy, let alone explain what's going on with your phone. So I don't think that's going to happen in primary care the way things are heading. The other thing to keep in mind is that doctors are corruptible like everybody else. So you have to be cautious about assuming that someone's a medical professional and they're going to be completely ethical in these matters. One thing I would like to see is a place like the University of Michigan, where we have all these bright IT people working on apps, trying to get wealthy themselves, like 23andMe investors. Why don't we have a competition at the university for an app that scans your phone, kind of like McAfee software, to tell you what apps are gathering what, and how you can be aware of which ones are placing cookies on your phone. They could even charge for it. A system like the University of Michigan Health System could subsidize it and give it to everybody who's a member of the system so they can put it on their own phones. So I think fighting the people who are making a lot of money by using apps to make money for someone else who can counter that might be a very effective way of going about it.
I think that's a terrific idea. And since, say Facebook, which makes billions of dollars, only makes about $4 per person, I'm constantly trying to get young engineers to do a privacy protective version of Facebook that I'd be willing to pay $5 or $10 a year for to keep my information, off the market.
And just to your first point, some estimates have said that if physicians were really doing all of the, required benchmarks, care in a primary care visit, it would take 7 hours. but they have 15 minutes.
Yeah, and just in closing, if we're putting together advisory committees to help these people and they're willing to pay ethicists a lot of money, my Twitter handle and my email address are on the slides.
We'll wrap it up here. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you to all three of you for a great conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Appreciate it.